I don't think it's necessary, but I'm helping chair on Duncan is going to talk about extended knowledge and education. I'm in education, and we will field questions afterwards.
That's right. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so well done for making it to the afternoon. We're going to be focusing more on implications of the research this afternoon. And one of the things I'm going to focus on here, as the title suggests, is some of the implications for education. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to be focusing on education in a developmental setting, so children's education, essentially. Now, education has lots of different goals. As I say here, some of them are social, some of them are practical. We want, in the lingo of the Scottish education system, we want confident learners, we want responsible citizens, we want students to have various practical skills, I give an example here, good handwriting, for instance. But some of these goals are specifically epistemic. And in fact, really, if you think about it, a core goal of education must be epistemic. That is, we want people to acquire bodies of information, of knowledge, and related things. We want them to be able to be good inquirers, to reason well, to think for themselves, that kind of thing. And, it's very difficult even to imagine an education system that doesn't have epistemic goals right at its heart. What would it be if it didn't have that? But this raises an interesting question, which is, well, what should we think of? How should we characterize the epistemic goals of education? Now, here's one picture that I think is quite pervasive in the media, but fortunately I think isn't shared by educators themselves, which is that really what you want from education is it's a sort of filler of buckets model, right? So you think of the students as sort of buckets, and the educator just puts in lots of facts. So you find this a lot. There's a certain sort of Daily Mail sort of conception of education. Why don't our children know X, A, B, and C facts about, let's say, I don't know, 1066 or Elizabeth I or what have you? That's one conception. That's one conception of the epistemology of education. You might think, well, that's all education is. It's about getting people to know lots of facts, have lots of information available to them. But actually the dominant view amongst educators, and I think the right view, is to say, well, really the ultimate focus is less on bodies of information, although obviously that does play a part, and more on the development of what I'm going to call here intellectual character. Now, we've come across this a little bit this morning, and I want to say a bit more about it here, but intellectual character, as I'm characterizing it, is it concerns an integrated set of your cognitive abilities, your cognitive skills, and your intellectual virtues. Now, often when we talk about this notion, it's harmless to run these two things together. So, I mean, Paul in his talk, it's perfectly reasonable, given the topic, ran the two elements of cognitive character together. But for my purposes, it's quite important to keep them apart, because they do actually have distinct properties. I think the best way to think about this is an intellectual virtue is an enhanced kind of cognitive skill or cognitive ability. So rather than it being distinct from it, it's just a particular kind of cognitive ability which is more enhanced. It's characterized by having certain motivational states attached to it. It often involves reflection. It often involves more sophisticated intellectual capacities. So here's a contrast to bring this out. Think of the contrast between perceiving versus observing. So perception is a cognitive skill. For most of us at any rate, we're reliable, we're good perceivers. But it's also, and indeed it's innate as well. It's the sort of thing we're born with. We can enhance it in various ways as we grow up, but the basic faculty is innate. But it's essentially passive. I mean, when you open your eyes, whether you want to find out lots of information about your environment or not, you will do. Just by opening your eyes, you get to see lots of things in your environment and you acquire lots of information that way. Observing is different though. Observing is active. Observing is interrogating your environment. It's searching out for things. It's inquiring of your environment. It's being attentive to appropriate things. A good observer is someone who can pick out salient facts about the environment. I mean, think, for example, Watson versus Holmes. Watson and Holmes, they're both presented with the same visual scene. But Holmes sees, he observes, he interrogates the scene in such a way that he actually comes to acquire all kinds of information that Watson just never seems to get his head around. So it's this more active state that I'm thinking of as intellectual virtue, right? And whereas cognitive abilities, they are more generally, they're just skills, but they needn't be essentially active. And I think intellectual character is this integrated set of both. So I think you've got the high-level stuff, being conscientious, being observant, being curious, inquisitive, and so forth. And you've also got the more basic skills as well, which don't involve that, and they're integrating their work together. And what we want in education is to promote intellectual character in just this sense. That's what we mean when we say to people that we want people to be able to think for themselves, reason for themselves, for example. That's intellectual character. Now, what's interesting is that in the epistemology of education, as in epistemology more generally, the assumption is individualistic. It's that, well, what we're trying to develop when we talk about intellectual character is just, as it were, the onboard cognitive skills and intellectual virtues of the subject. So the intellectual character is understood in an individualistic way, not in an extended way. So you get this, what I'm calling here an epistemic individualism, and it's not argued for often, it's just taken for granted that that's the way we should think about this. So education is about developing the onboard cognitive skills of the subject. But the problem is that it's difficult to square that with how children in particular, come to acquire their knowledge in educational settings. I mean even if suppose you don't even restrict yourself to educational settings, just think about what goes on outside the school. Think about the fact that increasingly children are learning in environments where they're technologically embedded in really quite rich ways. And so the thought starts to emerge that, well, if we take extended cognition seriously, then we should lose the epistemic individualism that guides a lot of epistemology, and in particular we should lose it when we're thinking about the epistemic goals of education. We should think about educational practices in such a way that they can allow for extended knowings. So, think, for example, of, I'm going to focus on cases of technology, but it doesn't have to be technology. I mean, think about children using tablets, for example, in educational settings. I mean, we were talking about this earlier in the breakout session. I mean, it's very interesting. My mother, who's 80, just cannot get her head around an iPad, and it's just, I've finally given up, actually. Whereas my kids, on the other hand, I never even need to explain to them how an iPad works, right? They just got it straight away. And now their use of the technology in their acquisition of information and so on is just so seamless that they use these devices in ways which are very similar to the way in which they use their onboard cognitive capacities. Now that's a technological case, but it doesn't have to be technological. There's a lot of reason to think that the social cues have a bearing on memory and how memory functions. So there you might have an example of a distributed cognition, and indeed you might have cases of that in educational settings. There may be certain kinds of cognitive skills that we're developing in educational settings are not just extended because they're using technology, but they're socially extended because they involve interactions between more than one cognitive subject. Moreover, I think it's really important that we shouldn't be thinking of extended knowledge or these extended cognitive skills that produce the knowledge as being in any sense second grade or not bona fide. One thing I've been trying to argue for in my work is that, that generally speaking, it's true, so whether you believe in extended knowledge or not, everyone should buy into a phenomenon which I call epistemic dependence, which is the way in which, when we come to have knowledge, we often are dependent in quite significant ways, not trivial ways, significant ways, on factors out with our own agency. And this is both positive and negative. So negatively, so sometimes we can exhibit high levels of cognitive agency and not know because of these situational factors. And other times we can exhibit quite relatively modest levels of cognitive agency, and yet we count as knowing because of features in our environment, maybe social features or technological features. And I think this is just a general feature of knowledge. So it's separate from extended knowing. That's just a fact about knowing that often that's the way it functions. And I think, as soon as one buys into that, the tendency to endorse individualism in epistemology lessens accordingly. I mean, I think a good illustration of this is actually if you think of some of the literature on cognitive bias. So cognitive bias, obviously, it can be a bad thing, it can be a vice, it can undermine knowing. But then in other kinds of cases, the cognitive bias, if that's what we want to call it, can also work in ways that are quite positive and enabling ways. It could be a kind of scaffolding. Scaffolding is a term you find a lot in educational theory. So the thought is that often when we're trying to teach, we're creating these scaffolded environments. Well, what we mean by that is that we're sort of epistemically enabling the learning to take place. And what going on here is, this is positive epistemic dependence. We're building something epistemically into the environment such that we're enabling the knowing to occur. And I think this is like a general feature. It manifests itself in a specific way in an educational setting, but I think it's something that happens all the while. In terms of the cognitive bias point, by the way, I think a good example of this, which some of you may have come across, is the famous Duncan candle experiment. I didn't come across this. It's a really cool experiment. So it's actually an example of a cognitive bias, what we call it these days, but it was discovered in the 40s before all the bias literature took off, so they didn't use that terminology themselves. And here's the thing. How you pose a problem, really quite incidental facts about how you pose a problem can have huge bearing on whether or not the problem can be solved, or how easy you find it to solve the problem. So in the Duncan candle experiment, you're given a candle and a box of tacks, and your challenge is to, I was trying to find a candle earlier on because it would have been nice to actually show you this in action. The challenge is to fix the candle so it's horizontal to the wall. Now, if you present the candle in the box of tacks just like that, people struggle. They take a tack out and they think, they try and tack the candle to the wall. If, however, you tip the tacks out of the box and give them the candle, the box, and the tacks, so it's 3 items rather than 2, suddenly people get the solution. Because the solution is, of course, to use the box, right? But people don't think of the box as something that's part of the solution if they're presented the box with the tacks in. They think of it just as the container for the tacks. So it's called a functional bias. We fixate on the box as being the thing that holds the tacks, rather than seeing that it's something which can be used as part of the solution to the problem. And this point generalizes. You can find in lots of problem settings that how you present the problem has a huge bearing on whether or not people can solve the problem. And I think often what's going on in educational settings is a kind of positive epistemic dependence where we're epistemically scaffolding the environment in order to enable the learning to occur. And I think this is a general phenomenon of positive epistemic dependence. The crucial thing is, though, once you buy that line, once you buy the idea of there being positive epistemic dependence and that it's compatible with knowing, then I think the impetus towards epistemic individualism starts to decline, and it now becomes far more easy, we've sort of primed you, as it were, for allowing for extended knowledge in an educational setting. So, so here the thought goes, right, so now we've embraced this, now we can think, we've got extended knowledge, we've got positive epistemic dependence, there is no worry anymore, it seems, about thinking of the cognitive skills that people are manifesting, the children are manifesting in educational settings as being potentially extended either through the use of technology or socially extended through distributed cognition. But then the question becomes, well, if that is the way to conceive of what's going on, so if we think of the epistemic goal of education as being development of intellectual character, we allow intellectual character to include extended cognitive abilities and skills, so extended knowing. Does that mean that that's all education is about? And I think actually this is where it gets interesting, where the distinction between intellectual virtue and mere cognitive abilities becomes important. Because although I think it's very straightforward to think of cognitive abilities as extended, it's not so straightforward to think of intellectual virtues as extended. Or at the very least, it's a tougher sell. I mean, it may be that there's some extension going on, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward and as widespread as you get with cognitive abilities. I think cognitive abilities very naturally extend. You put someone in a technologically embedded environment, I think they will naturally start to extend their cognitive abilities. Intellectual virtue doesn't quite work like that, I don't think. And I think there's some reasons for that. I think it's because of the fact that they're these active, reflective character traits, because the fact that they involve distinct motivational states, the fact that they're geared towards autonomy, make them the kinds of things that don't externalize quite so much. So I gave this example a moment ago of Holmes and Watson. On the one hand, we can imagine cognitively augmenting perception in lots of interesting ways, so that we have extended knowings. And we can imagine lots of straightforward ways in which that might occur. Google Glasses or what have you. But think about Holmes and what the kinds of intellectual traits that Holmes exhibits when he interrogates his environment. I mean, what would it mean for those kinds of traits to be externalized? I mean, they are essentially about his reflecting on his practices and acquiring those skills to interrogate the visual scene in ways that Watson hasn't quite managed. So we've got a sort of a different order of fit here. There's the cognitive abilities that so easily extend, and then the intellectual virtues, I think, which is hard to see how they can extend. If that's right, then although I think there is an important place for extended knowing within the educational context, it's limited by the fact that in developing intellectual character, we don't just want to develop cognitive abilities, we also want to develop intellectual virtues. And I think, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit. I think this point is going to become increasingly important as we start to move to educational settings where children will be increasingly embedded in information-rich technological environments. So let me give you some ramifications of this and why this is important. One ramification is concerned with testing. So if you don't buy extended knowledge, then you're going to think that testing will always be testing which is of the on-board cognitive abilities, right? So, I mean, this crops up quite a lot when we think about, in the media, it's a regular cycle of news stories where some exam board is going to allow dictionaries in the exam, or it's going to allow calculators in the exam, or it's going to allow phones in the exam. People cry out, oh, is this dumbing down? Well, the answer to that question is, well, it really does depend. It depends on what it is you're trying to evaluate. If what you're trying to evaluate is the purely on-board cognitive abilities of the subject, well, then obviously you shouldn't be testing them in a technologically enabled environment. But if, on the other hand, what you're testing is their extended cognitive abilities, well, then precisely what you should be doing is testing them in an extended environment, in a technologically enabled environment. The same point applies, incidentally, to social extension. If we think some of these cognitive abilities are distinctively social, then the way to evaluate them would be, as a group, it would be pointless to try and evaluate them individually. So this issue about dumbing down, I think, is a bit of a red herring, because it really, whether or not it is dumbing down, just depends on what it is you're trying to assess, whether it's extended knowing or non-extended knowing. So, but then there's an even further point, which is that we also need to remember in this context that the goal, if we grant the goal of education, the epistemic goal, isn't just about cognitive abilities, well then there's a further issue that needs to be brought in here, which is that when we evaluate, we're not just evaluating abilities extended or otherwise, so either not in technologically embedded environments or in technology environments, or not in social environments or in social environments. We should also need to find ways of developing and testing for the development of intellectual character. Just a little digression here, by the way. One of the projects I've been involved with recently at Edinburgh, which has been very rewarding, is trying to get philosophy into prison education. I mean, we say philosophy, really critical thinking, the development of intellectual character in a prison setting. And it's just really fascinating because you can do this. You can teach people these skills. And what's very interesting about it is that it doesn't presuppose any factual knowledge at all. And that's really important in the context of prison education, because often you're dealing with people who may have had no formal education. They may not even be literate. So you can't teach them in ways that presuppose lots of factual knowledge. But with intellectual character, you don't need to, right? Because it's a different kinds of skills. It doesn't presuppose that. And I think this is important when we think about it in educational settings. One of the things we're trying to assess for in performance is something about factual knowledge, performance of abilities, extended or otherwise. But another thing which is distinct again is this idea of intellectual character, critical thinking, critical reasoning, and so forth. And that's a different set of skills. Here's another implication, and I think this is something that's going to become increasingly important as we have this explosion of in the technology that's occurring at the moment. So there's various ways the technology might go. One way is in terms of cognitive augmentation of the individual. I mean, at the moment we're seeing this in terms of wearable tech. But over time, presumably, if we go down that route of cognitive augmentation, the wearable tech, as it were, will gradually become more and more invisible, become more and more inner, in fact. It'll be kind of like an internalized extended cognition. This is the kind of thing that Andy was talking about earlier. Maybe we start to get upgrades, so we're not even aware we're getting the upgrades. I mean, that's not the only way the technology might go. I mean, interestingly, the other route it could go is that the environment could become augmented. So you can imagine a scenario where it's not us we're not augmented, rather the environment becomes responsive to us in ways that it's constantly delivering all the information we seek, so that we don't need to be augmented. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Suppose it goes the first way, you're going to have the development of what you might start to think of as some people call neuromedia. If education is just about filling people's minds with facts, then education would be, from an epistemic point of view, would become completely redundant. I mean, in this particular brave new world, there's nothing for the educator to do. I mean, after all the student needs to do every time they've got a question is they'll do the internal analog of Googling it. So, coming to know what the capital of France is will be just as seamless as coming to know what you have for breakfast this morning. So just as, I know what I had for breakfast this morning just by introspecting, I could come to know what the Paris is the capital of France just by doing something of a similar, phenomenologically speaking, of a similar kind. So I think what this reminds us is that when we think about education and when we think about this explosion of information that's going to is gradually becoming available to us in an educational context, it reminds us that the point I made earlier, that education isn't really about the acquisition of this information. That's something else instead. I think it's about the development of active knowers. Active knowers are knowers that have the intellectual virtues, that can interrogate the information they receive, they can internalize it, think it through, scrutinize it, reason about it, and so forth. And those are the skills that we need to develop, and they're going to become increasingly important in a context where access to facts, access to knowledge, becomes seamless and incredibly easy. And I've got some references there if you want to chase those up, and also some other papers that we've written trying to talk about some of these ideas in a more less academic fashion. Thanks.